The college football season is just around the corner, and as we all know, it is one of the most exciting sports in the world. I definitely think it is the most exciting sport in the world. That is why I have a YouTube channel dedicated to it. But for each team, it can be exciting for different reasons. So in today's video, we're going over what I believe to be the most exciting thing about each college football team in the Power 4 for this upcoming season. But as always, welcome back, Capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. If you do end up enjoying this video, be sure to like and subscribe. Also, hit the comment section down below to tell me what you think is the most exciting thing about your favorite team. I want to hear it down below. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it, starting with none other than the Alabama Crimson Tide. And for me, it has to be the emergence of Keelan Russell. There has been a quarterback duel between Austin Mack and Keelan Russell, formerly the top prospect in the 2025 class. And out of spring camp, it is looking like he has the edge to be the starter for the Crimson Tide. He has an explosive upside that Alabama was truly missing at the quarterback position last season. I think he has the explosive upside of a Jalen Milroe a few years ago, but could be even more polished as a passer in the next 2 seasons. And next we have Arizona, and who else would we be talking about but Noah Fifita? He's been their quarterback the last few seasons. One of the best quarterbacks overall in the Big 12 last season, 64% passing, 3,400 total yards, and 32 touchdowns. I think with his dynamic play at quarterback, he's very easily going to keep Arizona towards the top of the Big 12 this year. And then we have Arizona State, which it's just going to be the health of this team overall. They had a few key injuries last year, mainly Sam Leavitt at quarterback really kept them from getting back to the top of the Big 12 last year. I think with an overall more healthy roster this year, they're going to be able to get back to that maybe top 4 in the conference, potentially even playing for the Big 12 title this year. And next we have Arkansas, and for Arkansas, I'm going to have to go with the offensive transfer portal. They bring in wide receiver Jamari Hawkins, Chris Marshall, Donovan Fopple, Jelani Watkins, and running backs Jasper Parker and Sutton Smith to ease the transition of Ryan Silverfield from Sam Pittman last year. And then we have the Auburn Tigers, and I think this one's pretty easy. It's going to be Byrum Brown at quarterback for the Tigers. There have been some concerns with his throwing motion, but he is one of the most elite playmakers in the sport at quarterback. He was last year at South Florida. And while he is making the jump to the SEC, I think he adds a much needed playmaking element that Auburn didn't quite have last season, especially with Jackson Arnold's arm last year. And then we have the Baylor Bears, and the biggest thing for the Bears is bringing in defensive coordinator Joe Klanderman, formerly of Kansas State. He takes a jump to Baylor after Chris Klieman retires. He was the defense coordinator at Kansas State since 2020. I think he automatically raises that floor defensively. That's been a real big struggle for Baylor the past few seasons. And next we have Boston College. I'm going to have to highlight their running back duo, Evan Dickens from Liberty and Nolan Ray from Maryland. 2 pretty good running backs. Hopefully they're able to carry the load offensively because Boston College is going to need it this year. And then it's BYU, and I'm just going to have to highlight the offense overall. Last year, I might have gone with the defense, but they lose their defense coordinator. So bringing back Bear Backmeyer, LJ Martin, their offensive line, and overall with them being a high floor offense that doesn't turn the ball over, I think this is going to be the most successful area for BYU this season. And after them, it's Cal, and this one's kind of a toss-up between getting Tosh Lupoi, formerly the Oregon defense coordinator, and bringing in some elite offensive weapons for Jaron Kioi Sagapulatele. I hope I pronounced that right. Not sure which will make more of an impact. I think Tosh Lupoi's defense will help raise the ceiling, but I definitely love those weapons that they bring in for JKS. So couldn't quite decide there, but for Cincinnati, it is completely cut and dry. That offensive line is going to carry the weight of this team this season. One of the better offensive lines overall in the sport. Have very, very high expectations for them this season. And that is similar to Clemson, who I am highlighting their front 7 defensively. They bring back some big names from last year in Sammy Brown, Will Helt, Jaheim Lawson, and they add a lot of transfer depth and size and a guy like Andy Burburia. I think that's how you pronounce it, the Iowa Western Community College guy. A lot to look forward in that front 7. And that brings us to Colorado, and I'm just going to highlight their overall portal class in general. Obviously, Colorado has been built through the portal the last few seasons with Deion Sanders as their head coach, but that portal class is highlighted with some elite weapons and guys like DeAndre Marr, Boo Carter, Leona Lafau, Santana Hopper, Danny Scudero. So there is a lot to look forward to in that department for the Buffaloes. And then for Duke, this is kind of a shot in the dark. I'm going to go with their defense, although it was not great last season. Obviously, Manny Diaz is a defensive-minded head coach, and even with the defense not being great last year, they were still able to float and hang around in conference enough to get to and win the ACC title game, surprisingly. So I trust they'll take a step forward back to what we saw in 2024 defensively under Manny Diaz. And then we have Florida, and this one's pretty easy for me. It's grabbing John Sumrall from Tulane, grabbing Buster Faulkner from Georgia Tech at offensive coordinator. I think those two coaches are going to raise the floor of this Florida Gators team, especially with the talent they have. I've talked about it elsewhere, so I won't get into it too much in this video. And then after them, it is their rival, Florida State. And the biggest thing for Florida State is just their defensive coordinator, Tony White. Despite the team not being great last year, the defense was very solid. Tony White has been a very, very solid defensive coordinator in his time in college football. And in year two, I expect much of the same for that defense for Tony White. And that brings us to Georgia. And this one is a little bit specific. It's the returning production on the defensive side of the ball. They haven't been bad on defense the past few years, but they haven't quite been the elite of the elite. This year, they returned 78% of their total snaps on defense, which is 12th in the country. I think for Glenn Schumann, that adds an element of experience, an element of returning production that they didn't quite have last season. I think they definitely take a step up defensively. And then we have Georgia Tech, and that's going to be the run game. Their offensive line has been very good. They lose their offensive line coach, but Brent Key is an offensive line-minded coach. They return 65% of the snaps at offensive line. They have Justice Haynes from Michigan coming in at running back. They return Malachi Hosley. That could be one of the best running back duos in the country this year. And after them, it is Houston. And I could have highlighted a few different things, but I'm just going to say Connor Wigman in general. I really like his game. Really like how he's elevated going from Texas A&M now in the Willie Fritz offense at Houston. Last year, 65% passing, 3,400 total yards, and 36 touchdowns. He's one of the best pro spread quarterbacks in the country, and his backup is also very, very good, very sought after high school prospect as well. And after them, we have Illinois. This one's a little bit of a cop-out. I'm just going with Brett Bielema in general. He tends to overperform as a coach. He has so far at Illinois. Averages about 7.5 wins per year. In the past 2 seasons in the post-division Big Ten, he's averaged 9 wins a season, so would not be surprised at all if he goes above his win total this year, which is, I believe is set to either 5.5 or 6.5. And then we have Indiana. You could go for a whole lot of things on Indiana. Indiana is one of the best teams overall in the sport. I want to highlight the defense in general, starting with the defensive coordinator in Bryant Haynes, probably the best coordinator in the sport at the moment, if you ask me. They return guys in Tyreek Tucker, Mario Landino on that defensive line, Elijah Hardy, Isaiah Jones at linebacker, Jamari Sharp, Amari Farrell at defensive back, and they bring in a very, very, very impressive transfer portal haul, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Add a ton of talent and depth there as well, so that defense is going to be stacked again this year. And then it's Iowa, who's much of the same. You could go one of two ways. I just put Phil Parker, who I also believe is a top 10 defensive coordinator in the sport, or you could go with the offensive line. I would not argue with either. That offensive line returns some great guys and guys like Trevor Locke and Cade Piper. I think they will be one of the best units in the Big Ten, probably one of the best units overall in the country as well. And then it's Iowa State, and while they do lose a lot, they add a lot of exciting things, especially the quarterback Jalen Rayner, who last year at Arkansas State had a 67% completion percentage, over 3,700 total yards, and 26 touchdowns at quarterback. He'll be a super effective player both with his arm and with his legs at quarterback for the Cyclones this year, which brings us to the Kansas Jayhawks. I'm going to highlight specifically their running back room. They bring in Dylan Edwards, formerly of Kansas State and Colorado, Yassine Willis, and Jalen Tabri. Those guys average over 5 yards per carry at their respective schools last year, which is big for a team like Kansas, who only averaged 4.5 rushing yards per attempt last year. And next we have Kansas State, and the biggest thing for me is just the pairing of Colin Klein with Avery Johnson. I think Avery Johnson is a quarterback who had a lot of potential coming into his career, has kind of hit his ceiling at Kansas State so far, but I think if anybody can unlock that next level for Avery Johnson, turn him into a top 3 quarterback in the Big 12, I think it will be Colin Klein. And after them, we have Kentucky, and this is just going to be their offensive upside. They have a great transfer portal haul. They bring in Will Stein, formerly the Oregon offensive coordinator, to be their next head coach. I really like Kenny Minchie at quarterback. They have a revamped offensive line that looks pretty solid. They have solid weapons to work with Minchie. And like I said, that Will Stein pro-style offense will probably be pretty good, even though they're not the most talented team in the country. And then it's their rival, the Louisville Cardinals. The biggest thing for the Cardinals, in my opinion, is getting Isaac Brown back healthy this year. In 2025, he led the ACC in yards per carry. And in 2026, before he got injured, he led the entire country in yards per carry with almost 9 yards per per attempt in just over 100 attempts last year. He's one of the best running backs overall, and they have Keywan Brown behind him. That rushing attack should be very, very good once again for the Cardinals. And then we have LSU. This one's also pretty obvious in my opinion. It's the staff overhaul. They keep Blake Baker. They bring in Charlie Weiss Jr. at offensive coordinator, and then they bring in, of course, Lane Kiffin as their head coach. I think that's one of the best overall staffs in the country. I think they could end up making the SEC championship in year one with that staff, which brings us to the Maryland Terrapins. I'm going to highlight Malik Washington. Definitely struggled with efficiency overall as a quarterback, but he's still untapped overall as a quarterback, and Mike Locksley does have a good track record with quarterbacks unlocking that potential and really getting them to the best of their ability. And then we have Miami. This is another team you could go very, very many ways. I wanted to talk about the staff because it stays intact and it's a very, very good staff, but I'm just going to highlight the upgrade at quarterback. I think going from Carson Beck to Darian Mensah adds a level of explosiveness that they lived off of last year. Now I think it is even better with Darian Mensah as your starting quarterback. And that brings us to Michigan, and the most exciting thing for the Wolverines is the upgraded staff. I think without a doubt they are getting better overall, and bringing in Kyle Whittingham as your head coach, bringing in Jason Beck as your offense coordinator formerly of Utah, and bringing in Jay Hill at defensive coordinator. I think he's probably a top 10, if not easily top 15 defensive coordinator in the sport. And that brings us to Michigan State, and I'm going to have to go with the offensive upside. I wouldn't necessarily say they're going to be a great offense in year one with Pat Fitzgerald, but they do have the quarterback Eliseo Milajovic. I'm not quite sure if that's correct. They bring in Cam Edwards, one of the best running backs in the group of 6 last year at UConn. They bring in Jason Patterson, and they have a reworked offensive line. I think definitely a lot more upside, I would say, in year one with Pat Fitzgerald than the past few seasons. And next, it is the Minnesota Golden Gophers, and I'm just going to leave it at their trench play should be very, very good. Once again, it is perennially very good on the offensive side of the ball, and on the defense, they return guys in Anthony Smith, could be one of the best defensive ends in the sport. And on the opposite side, they bring back Jackson Howard, who is also very, very good as an edge rusher last season. On top of that, they add a ton of size in the interior of that defensive line. I think both sides are going to be very, very good, which could end up meaning they go over on their win total this year. And for Ole Miss, this one's pretty simple. It's bringing back Trinidad Chambliss, it's bringing back Kuwan Lacey, and it's adding Mekhi Frazier at running back. Those are two of the most explosive players in the sport in Chambliss and Lacey. Mekhi Frazier has gone very, very untapped at Michigan State the past few seasons. I think he could explode. Very well could potentially be a running back room where both running backs go over 1,000 yards. Not quite sure that will happen because of the passing volume that offense might see this year. But that brings us to Mississippi State, and the biggest thing for the Bulldogs this year, in my opinion, is going to be Zach Arnett returning as their defensive coordinator. Was very, very good in that role under Mike Leach a few years ago. He returns, could get Mississippi State back to a point defensively to where they're able to compete for bowl eligibility, potentially cause a few upsets in SEC play this year. And then it's Missouri, and I'm super excited about their offense as a whole next year. Their offensive line is one of the better units in the SEC. They bring back Jamal Roberts at running back, who is very good. Ahmad Hardy is a question mark because unfortunately there was a horrific incident with him this season. I think he should be ready for the 2026 season, but we don't quite know yet. But behind both of those guys, they also bring in one of the best running backs from the FCS level in Ja'Shawn Edwards. And overall, I think getting Austin Simmons from Ole Miss is an upgrade over Bo Pribula and Matt Zollers from last season. And then we have NC State, and this one's easy. It's going to be the quarterback, CJ Bailey, one of the best quarterbacks overall in the ACC last year. Almost 70% completion percentage, over 3,300 total yards, and 31 total touchdowns for Bailey. He's one of the most explosive players overall, can hurt you in a number of ways. Very, very dynamic quarterback. Going to be the biggest X factor once again for the Wolfpack this year. And then it's Nebraska, and this one's a bit sneaky. I really like their offensive line this year. Last year, the tackles caught a lot of flack because they gave up a ton of sacks. How much of that was the tackles' fault? How much of that was Dylan Raiola's fault? We don't quite know, but they do bring in Georgia Tech's former offensive line coach in Jeep Wade. They add a ton of snaps through the transfer portal in guys like Brendan Black, formerly of Iowa State, and Tree Babalade, formerly of South Carolina. They also have a few sneaky pieces already in that room, and guys like their center, Justin Evans, and the tackle, formerly of Alabama, Elijah Pritchett. I personally think that unit could be one of the most underrated in the country this year. And that brings us to North Carolina. I'm going to say Bobby Petrino is the most exciting part for this team. Last year, they were a complete corpse offensively at times. I think bringing in Bobby Petrino, formerly of Arkansas last year, gives you a clear identity. You understand better what you want to achieve this year, and overall should be a ton more explosive in year one with Petrino. And after them, we have Northwestern. I'm going to say David Braun. I really love David Braun overall as a head coach because he knows exactly who Northwestern is. They're never going to be a team that competes for the Big Ten title, probably not going to make the college football playoff anytime soon, but they always play very, very close, if not reaching their ceiling every single season, getting bowl eligible, winning around 6 or 7 games a year. And that's even with the harsh academic standards that come with coaching a team like Northwestern. And next we have Notre Dame, another team that you could go a few different ways with. I'm going to highlight the offensive line. I think it could potentially be the best in the sport. That title I think could go to a few different teams. There's a few different arguments, but overall, one of the most talented units overall in the sport, one of the best coached units overall in the sport. I would not be surprised at all if Notre Dame is once again one of the best offensive lines, if not the best offensive lines in college football this year. And then we have the Ohio State Buckeyes. I would not blame you one bit if you said Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith, but I personally am going with Matt Patricia as the most exciting thing about this team next year. I think they were potentially the best defense overall in the sport last year. Definitely top 5, and that's a lot due to the fact that Matt Patricia is one of the best scheming defensive coordinators in the sport currently. I think even with losing some of the key pieces they lost in this past offseason, they should be once again in that top 5 realm. They're definitely going to be one of the scariest defenses overall as long as Patricia is there. And that's similar to Oklahoma, who's our next team. I'm going to highlight specifically though their front 7. I think they bring back 2 of the best defensive linemen in the sport in Taylor Ween and David Stone at defensive tackle. On top of that, 2 elite linebackers in Kip Lewis and Owen Heineke. And as we all know, Brent Venables is one of the best defensive minds in the sport. They're going to be solid outside of those guys, but those 4 are elite defensive players, going to be one of the scariest front 7s to face in the sport this year. And then we have Oklahoma State. This one's pretty easy. They bring in Eric Morris. That offense should be very, very exciting, at least maybe borderline one of the better offenses in the sport if all works out. They bring in quarterback Drew Mestemaker, wide receiver Wyatt Young, and running back Caleb Hawkins from North Texas, who were 3 of the best players at their respective positions in the group of 6 last year. And then for the Oregon Ducks, I have to just go ahead and say their roster is the most exciting thing about this team this year. They're going to match up well with any team they face this year, any team they might face in the playoff. There is a ton to love, including Dante Moore, including that defensive line, including the wide receiver core, the running back core, the offensive line. You name it, they have at least a great unit at any position this year. And then we have Penn State. You could go a couple different ways. They, of course, bring in Matt Campbell. I'm going to highlight specifically this defense. Bringing in D'Anton Lane at defense coordinator is a huge step forward for the Nittany Lions. They add 5,600 portal snaps, which is 11th in the country on the defensive side of the ball. On top of attaining all that talent, they keep elite standout players and guys like Tony Rojas, Darius Dixon, Zion Tracy, and Adavian Collins this year. And then we have the Pittsburgh Panthers, and I'm really excited to see Mason Heinschel in his first full season at quarterback. He almost got that last year, played 10 games for Pitt, where he had a 64% completion percentage, 2,400 total yards, and 18 touchdowns as a true freshman quarterback. His sophomore season should be one of the more exciting sophomore seasons in the sport this year. And that brings us to Purdue, and I'm going to highlight they actually have a pretty solid transfer portal class. I believe On3 has it top 25 overall. It's headlined defensively by guys like Elo Mendozi, JoJo Hayden, and Jaden Mangum. And on offense, Jarrett Gibson from Texas, Fame Ijiboy from Minnesota, and Xavier Townsend from Iowa State. I could see those guys coming in and having an immediate impact on Purdue, maybe even getting them close to bowl eligibility this year. And then we have Rutgers, and I'm going to look at the offense here. They do lose Ethan Kaliak-Manis, who's one of my favorite Big Ten quarterbacks last year, but whoever they bring in is going to have the safety blanket of guys in KJ Duff at wide receiver, one of the best wide receivers in the Big Ten this year, and Antoine Raymond, one of the best Big Ten running backs this year. Should absolutely take a ton of the pressure off of whoever is their quarterback this year. And then we have SMU. I'm going to go with Kevin Jennings here. There is a lot to like overall about this SMU team, but Kevin Jennings, the past 2 seasons, 66% completion percentage, 3,600 yards, and 30 touchdowns in both seasons. One of the best quarterbacks overall in the ACC. He has SMU perennially towards the top of that conference, maybe even making the title game once again this year. And then we have South Carolina. I'm going to highlight the most exciting thing about this team is the additions they've made at offensive line. That is an area where they struggled last season, couldn't get Lenore Sellers consistent protection, couldn't develop a consistent run game either through that offensive line. They add the most snaps on the offensive line in the entire FBS at 5,100 total snaps. There are still question marks there. There's still some injury concerns, but overall, I think that can't hurt them in 2026. And then we have Stanford. This one's pretty difficult. I just put, you guys have a coach now. It's not the interim Frank Reich last year. We'll see how well Tavita Pritchard does, but I think having a real coach, non-interim coach in there now is exciting for recruiting, exciting for what they could possibly do this season. And next we have Syracuse. The most exciting thing for the Orange, in my opinion, is returning returning Steve Angeli. He, of course, gets injured last season. And in those first 4 games before he got injured, 63% completion percentage, 1,300 yards, and 11 total touchdowns, which I know this isn't how it works, but if he played a full season with those numbers, you're looking at nearly 4,000 passing yards, over 30 touchdowns, which of course would have been one of the best performances at quarterback in all the country last year. And after that, we have TCU, and I'm actually super excited about their transfer portal quarterback, Jaden Craig from Harvard. I think he's one of the more underrated transfer portal prospects in the sport this season. I think losing Josh Hoover is of course hard to deal with, but I think replacing him in a guy like Jaden Craig, who honestly mirrors a lot of what Josh Hoover was doing just with less turnovers overall, is very exciting for that offense. I think with their style of play, Craig could end up being one of the best quarterbacks, at least from a statistical standpoint, in the Big 12 this year. And he has shown at least some ability to move around in the pocket. I think more so than Josh Hoover showed you last year. And after them, we have Tennessee, and I'm going to say everything except the quarterback offensively. I don't hate their quarterbacks, but obviously there is still a lot of unproven potential at that position. I do really love their offensive line though. I love Deshaun Bishop returning at running back. They have a few guys, I believe Javen Gordon from Tulane coming in at that position as well. I love their wide receivers in Braylon Staley and Mike Matthews. I think they will help whoever the quarterback is out a ton, as well as the safety blanket tight end and Ethan Davis. And then we have Texas. You could go a number of ways. They're super talented, super well coached. They bring in Will Muschamp, but I'm going to say the most exciting thing for this team is their upgraded offensive line. I think that specifically is what held them back from being a potential playoff team last year. They had Melvin Siani at offensive tackle from Wake Forest, one of the best overall tackle prospects from the transfer portal class this year. They bring in depth and potential rotational talent in guys like Lawrence Seymour and Dylan Sikorsky in the interior as well. And then we have their rival in Texas A&M. I think the most exciting thing about this team this year is the offense. They of course return Marcel Reed, they return Ruben Owens, Mario Craver, Ashton Bethel Roman as well. And despite losing some key pieces on the offensive line, they add a healthy amount of portal snaps at that position group. Over 2,500 snaps added at that position group, which is 18th in the country for the Aggies this year. And on top of that, Mike Elko isn't known for having bad offensive or defensive line, so the offense as a whole should easily stay afloat despite some of those losses this year. And then we have the Texas Tech Red Raiders. This one's pretty easy. They're the most talented team in their conference, and it's not particularly close. Spoiler alert there, guys. I'm so sorry about that. I am going to have Texas Tech once again making the playoff just based on how overmatched they're going to be in every single conference game this year. And after that, we have UCF in the Big 12. I really like the fact that Frost has probably found his quarterback in Alonzo Barnett, formerly of James Madison. Frost is a guy who loves his mobile quarterbacks. He loves running the ball with the quarterback. Last year, Barnett had a sub 60% completion percentage, but did have over 3,300 total yards and 38 touchdowns. I believe 15 of those 38 touchdowns were rushing touchdowns as well. So a very dynamic player overall, not an elite passer by any stretch of the imagination, but should be an overall upgrade from what they had last season. And that brings us to the UCLA Bruins. I am very high on this team overall because they get Bob Chesney. I believe the pairing offensively with what they already have, with what they bring in from James Madison, and with the pairing of Chesney and Nico Iamaleava, I think that's a match made in heaven. I think the offense could be one of the more scary units overall in the Big Ten this year. Definitely one of the more underrated going into this season. And next we have the USC Trojans. I'm going to specifically highlight the offensive line. I caught some flack from USC fans for not including them in my top 10 overall. I would say they're definitely either 11 or 12, just outside, but they return all 5 starters. They were one of the more underrated units as a whole last season. They were a big reason why that running game was so effective, why Jaden Maiava was able to be so accurate last season. I definitely think they're going to be one of the best units in the Big Ten this year, very, very easily so. And next we have Utah. I'm going to just go ahead and say Devin Dampier. He's one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the sport. I know a lot of people hate on his passing game, but it's not bad at all. I'm not sure why he gets the hate he does. One of the best dynamic quarterbacks overall in the sport heading into this season, which brings us to Vanderbilt. I'm going to go ahead and say Tim Beck is the most exciting thing about this team this year. Losing Diego Pavia is going to hurt, but Tim Beck's offense is a very high floor type of offense. I think you can plug a guy like Jared Curtis, who is obviously inexperienced. He is coming out of high school, but you can plug a guy like that in and not see too much regression offensively. I think that's going to be their strong suit once again in the SEC this year. And that brings us to the ACC runner-up Virginia Cavaliers this year, and I'm once again going to have to say offensive line. One of the most underrated, kind of like Nebraska, but I think it's probably a bit better than Nebraska. Their 5 projected starters this year are all in their graduate years, so a lot of college football has been played in that unit. One of the most experienced offensive lines overall in the sport in 2026. And after them, it is the Virginia Tech Hokies. This one's pretty obvious. It's going to be that new staff. They bring in James Franklin as their head coach. I think that instantly elevates this team, elevates this roster overall. They bring in former co-offensive coordinator at Penn State since 2023 and Ty Howell. And they bring back their former head coach last season as their defense coordinator in Brent Pry, one of the best defensive minds in the sport. He was brought into Virginia Tech originally to upgrade that defense. Didn't quite work out, but being able to retain him at defense coordinator, that's a miracle, folks. I'm not sure how James Franklin was able to do that, but it makes me very, very excited for this team overall next year. And next we have Washington. I'm going to highlight the skill positions as my most exciting unit on this team. Damon Williams at quarterback, one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the sport last season. They bring in Jaden Lamar from Oregon. They retain Jordan Washington from last season. Those two running backs could be one of the most slept on in the Big Ten this year. At receiver, they bring back Desmond Roebuck. They bring back Decker DeGraff, who's one of the best tight ends in the Big Ten last year, and they add Christian Moss from Kennesaw. I think overall this could be one of the sneakiest and most explosive offenses in the sport this year. And next is West Virginia, and in the second year of the new Rich Rod era, I am super excited about Michael Hawkins Jr. at quarterback, formerly the backup at Oklahoma, and Cam Cook, formerly of, I believe, Jacksonville State last year. Two dynamic players that are going to fit very, very well inside this Rich Rodriguez offense. I'm super high on Michael Hawkins Jr., probably more so than a ton of people. I had him as one of my top 10 breakout quarterbacks for this season. I think he could end up being one of the top quarterbacks in the Big 12, maybe top 5. And Cam Cook goes without saying, I believe he had the most rushing yards overall in the sport last year. I could be wrong. I believe it was something like 1,616 touchdowns or something like that. Those are two elite playmakers being added to that West Virginia offense, which is very, very exciting to say the least. And rounding out our list, it is none other than the Wisconsin Badgers, and they have one of the more underrated transfer portal hauls in the sport this year. On3 has them as a top 15 haul. They bring in Colton Joseph at quarterback, who I believe is going to be the best quarterback that Luke Fickell has had at Wisconsin so far. They bring in a ton of depth and honestly some rotational talent at both offensive and defensive line. They bring in a nice secondary overhaul, and they bring in some nice offensive weapons to pair with Colton Joseph, and guys like Abu Sama from Iowa State, Brian Jackson from USC, and Shamar Rigney of Oklahoma State. I think this could be a sneaky good team in the Big Ten. Do I have them going over 8 wins? Probably not, but definitely a lot better. Probably the best season in Luke Fickell's tenure at Wisconsin this year. And that's going to wrap up what I believe are the most exciting things about each Power 4 team this year. Once again, be sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy it. Drop a comment about the favorite thing you have for your favorite team in 2026. And with that, thank you for watching. Be sure to tune into my season previews for some of the biggest names in college football this year. Be sure to tune in next week to see that return, and I hope to see you there.